It was becoming hard to deny that something was clearly wrong. The further James and his team left Quathron's bunker behind them, the clearer the sound of unrest all around them grew. Far off and not so far off, screams, yells and bangs filled the air and spread an uneasy mood all throughout, even in the more peaceful areas. And apart from the clashing forces of the rioting people of Dunamur and the law enforcement of Tsakantiot, trying to keep them at bay, everything appeared to be swept clear of people. It was likely that any rich folk at the station that had gotten the opportunity had swiftly decided to get themselves to safety while they still could. Hopefully they had at least taken their workers with them. Still, although the area they were moving through was remarkably quiet considering the situation, and despite the highly trained armed guards surrounding him on all sides, it had been a while since James had been this ready for conflict. His left hand was tightly clenching the weapon on his hip, ready to draw at a moment's notice, while he held his right close to his body, putting constant tension into the mechanical muscles like a spring that got pushed together, always in a position to move with explosive speed with a single thought, or even less than that. Of course, his guards were in even more defensive positions than he was, having taken their earlier behaviour of moving in pairs of two and checking every turn ahead with trained position back up. Although he was the VIP in this situation, and was therefore technically not expected to be fully aware of any of the tactics, James's own training told him to intuitively remain behind a sort of imaginary line that was formed between the two soldiers of the pairs of two that had taken the lead, which were staying back while their buddy checked and cleared the stretch of road ahead of them. Only once they moved to catch up with the rest of their group would he also follow, and he indicated for Shida at his side to do the same. Therefore, the group moved in an almost caterpillar-like way, in which the anchor of the group needed to somewhat catch up to the point again, before the entire formation would move forward. That may have made their advances slightly slower, however, it ensured they would stick together and always face any obstacles, be they front or back of them, with their full available force. This not only strengthened their position, but also brought some peace of mind to every soldier, who knew they would never have to face any opposition alone. A valuable tactic, but also a psychological measure for the socially evolved primates. Something that could clearly be seen when observing Shida in the situation, who clearly wasn't as comforted by the constant pauses as they were. James noticed the feline getting angsty whenever they stopped, as she not quite nervously, but definitely tensely stepped in place, and was obviously more than ready to just continue walking and make more distance quicker that way. But it wasn't all rosy for the humans either, especially now that adrenaline was inadvertently pumping through their blood, and by extension their brain, forcing both their vision and focus to become the slightest bit tighter than it usually was. The big, smooth and flowing walls of the Miet architecture, combined with their skin colour, seemed more than ever like enormous, indistinct waves towering over each side of the street. The smooth edges and similar colours led to the contrast between them being minimal, leading to even the keen eyes of the humans sometimes missing a small side street or back alley hidden in between two of them, until they stood right in front of it, meaning the soldiers leading the formation had to be extra careful not to blindly run into a possibly compromising position, especially against an enemy that could likely hear them approach long before they would have any idea that it was there. Of course, the word enemy was used rather loosely in that. After all, the people of Dunamur weren't actually their foes by any stretch of the imagination. They had just gotten caught up in a very bad situation here. In a gesture that had already become something of a routine in the short time they had been moving, Admir lifted his hand with only index and middle finger raised, indicating that there was another turn ahead that he would have to clear, meaning his buddy should get ready to advance once he gave the signal. However, as he went to look around the corner, he had barely taken the slightest peek before he had already pulled his head back, right before moving it in the direction of the turn again, this time even more carefully. His hand shot up for more signs. Visual, group, at least 10 confirmed, likely more, status unknown, he quickly imparted with simple movements of his hand. At this point, they were technically all connected through their military filters, taking up the extra function of short-term radios now that it had become necessary, but given the Mia's fine hearing, James understood the impulse not to speak while standing who knows how close to them. Tuyer's buddy immediately took it upon themselves to make a quick noise in his stead, letting out a brief "Shh" to alert the lieutenant to the fact that something was happening and that she should stop her advances as well. They then quickly and quietly related the information she had just missed to her, and, seeing that she also stood a lot closer to the presumed hostiles than anyone else, she simply curled her index finger and thumb to and "OK," before taking a few steps back in a less open area and holding her position there. What now? If those were actual hostiles, it would likely be easy enough to take them out, but this situation was a bit more delicate. Could they maybe just walk past? It wasn't impossible that protesters wouldn't particularly care about pursuing an off-world diplomat after all. Maybe they would just let them be on their way without bothering them. Still, although that wasn't impossible, it was a bit too optimistic of an approach to just go with it. And sneaking past was probably not an option either, not with the Mia's ears, and not in the bright light of an artificial station day. Another way then? But which one? It was hard to tell which ones would even lead to their destination, apart from the one they already knew. And even if they found one, who told them that that wouldn't be blocked as well? Still, no real use in pondering maybes and wondering what-ifs. Steps right behind James's back made him turn in place, and within a second he was very quickly reminded of just how rusty he still was, despite having started his training back up. After all, they weren't flying nearly as blind as he thought for a moment there. Wordlessly, Andres stretched out the softly glowing screen of a phone, showing a schematic map of the station. Simple deduction led James to the assumption that the area it was currently zoomed in on was likely indicative of their current location, even if there was no green dot indicating as much. James and Sheena both stared at the map, although admittedly, James wasn't paying the attention that he should in the first few seconds, because he was slightly baffled at his sheer neglect of the fact that this was a very public place, with very publicly available data and maps. Had he relied on the briefings from their intelligence this much back in the day? It was almost shocking. Luckily, Sheena was there to pick up his slack for him, because she was immediately very interestedly engaged with the map, and eagerly took in any information it provided to her with a finger pondering on her lips. Her yellow eyes darted in quick micro-twitches as her gaze moved along the small screen. Soon after, she lifted her finger and questioningly pointed at an oddity she had quickly noted. While there were plenty of ways around the obstruction that they could have technically taken, snaking around on the map like disorganized cables, splitting up and rejoining with each other all over the station's rectangular floor, one that stood out was one that appeared to be running almost perfectly parallel to the one they were currently walking. It was drawn semi-transparently, in a way that overlaid the high buildings to their right, while also seemingly cutting right through the side street that was currently occupied by the group of questionable Miat that had apparently set up a temporary camp there for the time being. At least Abner, who was still watching them, didn't make any indications that he suspected them to be leaving anytime soon. If James had to guess, they were either waiting to possibly ambush any unsuspecting people coming by, or they were hiding away from the authorities for the time being. Either way, that way on the map was strange. It wasn't drawn in like a full-on wall that would block you from passing. It looked more like it was either over or under it. James looked to the ground, getting some flashbacks to the last station he had to sneakily traverse. Then again, would maintenance tunnels even be depicted on a map like the one they were using as a reference here? It didn't really look like it, considering they would likely be everywhere, and although he could see one or two, more like the one they were checking out on their section of the map, they seemed to be sticking to rather specific spots instead. "Cole, is there anything above the way?" he whispered over the open radio line, deciding to clear that up quickly. After all, in a way completely parallel to their own would be rather handy, and he didn't even notice that he had somehow slipped into using a call sign in the process. He could see Cole, better known as Abner, slightly lift his head as he carefully peeked into the side street, and as soon as he had done so, his hand shot up in a yes. Then it quickly curled into another word. Tunnel. A tunnel? Up in the air? Well, probably not a literal tunnel, but something like an enclosed walkway. Yes, that must have been it. James looked up. Above him was nothing but dark, towering walls and a faraway ceiling, as far as he could see. So whatever it wasn't high above their heads, or even above the buildings really, meaning it was most likely connected to them in some way. In fact, now he even felt like he had remembered seeing something like that when they walked around the station earlier. Or had he? Not wasting much time on deliberation, Andres quickly gave a sign towards Athena, indicating for her to check the door of the adjacent building. But, although the walkway above their obstacle's head sounded alluring, James admittedly had little hopes for it, because even without checking, that door looked pretty locked to him. Not exactly a reason not to try it out, but he still wasn't exactly surprised when his suspicions turned out to be right. Nobody was, to be fair. Athena could wave, pull and rattle at it all she wanted. The mechanical gate didn't budge. Most likely it wouldn't, unless they tore it down. No luck. Her high voice informed everyone about what they already knew, as she shook her head with a calm resignation. Only to then be almost literally jump-scared moments later, when the locks of the door, defying all expectations, suddenly disengaged, allowing it to slowly open just a crack wide. Athena didn't quite jump, but she took a definite and quick step away from the door in surprise while simultaneously rotating her torso so she could level her weapon right in the opening that had formed with deadly precision, obviously awaiting to see whoever had opened it waiting inside. The weapons of her, as well as Andres' body, also twitched towards the opening door, and even James had, at the very least, unholstered his pistol. But it quickly became clear that there was no one there, at least not immediately behind the door. This allowed Athena to walk away. Slowly, and with tiny steps that wouldn't disrupt her aim, she moved herself into a more defensible position that would still allow her to easily keep an eye on the door so she could watch out for whatever might come out of there. A door suddenly opening by itself usually wasn't a good sign in their line of work. Then again, something like this had happened just earlier. As if he had already expected it, James felt a quick vibration in his pocket. Not one that made any sound, and not one that was holding on for long. Just one quick vibration to hopefully catch his attention. Pulling his phone out without much regard for anything at that moment, James didn't even look at it as he answered the call. "Please tell me that was you," he said immediately into the line. It wasn't that he actually wanted anyone to be helping them out behind the scenes here. It was more that one less unknown in the mix would be highly appreciated. "That was me," a Veselon's steady voice immediately replied, apparently deciding to skip the preamble as well since he had done so. Inadvertently, James's eyes darted to the facade of the building, the door of which had just been opened. Especially, he was looking for the carving embedded into the wall, right next to the door. Two arms closed around what looked like the crude depiction of a child from behind, in what looked like an approximation of an embrace. It was decidedly not the hand embalming claw marks. That building did not belong to the Zishidi Comatalpeno. However, it did still have cameras, even on the outside. Cameras turned noticeably towards him and his group. "I thought you might appreciate the assistance," they added, after James didn't reply anything for a while. To be completely honest, he wasn't quite sure if he did. Not that he didn't appreciate the thought, if it was an honest one. Just, the more crazy stuff happened involving them, the harder of a time he had to actually believe in the honesty of a Veselon's actions. Then again, after earlier, was he maybe way off the mark here? The thought came up in his mind, but luckily it didn't last long. Rusty or not, it seemed that his gut feeling was not completely detached from any reason yet, because one look around him indicated that even though they had all only caught his half of the conversation, none of his companions looked even remotely enthusiastic about acting on the perceived offer extended to them. It was of course the clueless for Shida, since her scrupulous face was unobscured by anything as she stared back at him with her thin lips tightly pressed together and her eyes locked in an uncompromising gaze. But even the facsimiles of faces projected onto the filters of his human guards showed rather blank and distrusting expressions. Some, like Athena for example, even opting to slightly shake their head in a disapproving manner as soon as they noticed he was looking at them. "Thank you, but that won't be necessary," James said into the phone, before returning his attention to the map, even though a heavy feeling was building up inside of his gut. Putting his still-drawn gun away again, he lifted a finger and pointed at an alleyway they had passed some time ago that would, after a minor detour and some turns, lead them back into their intended direction. He then looked around, studying Shida's and Andres' faces. After a moment of contemplation, they both nodded. "Regroup, we found the way," Andres quickly announced, which caused the squad to quickly regroup into their previous formation again, although their previous point was now their anchor, and vice versa. Obviously Admir also kept their backs clear by continuously observing the group of felines in the side street for as long as he could. "What has earned me your distrust, Mr. Alwyn?" Veselon asked, as James made his first steps in the brief backtrack they'd have to undertake before they could follow their new route. The answer was, a lot of things. However, James didn't exactly feel like explaining, so his answer remained at, "You don't have to earn distrust." "But you do have to earn trust?" Veselon almost immediately asked, their snappy replies forming a rather big contrast to the earlier, rather slow replies to anything. Usually, James replied humorously, while Andres stopped a good way in front of him to reclear the first side street they'd have to pass on their way back. Then why won't you allow me to do that? Avezlon continued their questioning, sounding slightly displeased at the cold way James was reacting with. I've adhered to all your requests so far. James didn't know if that was true or not. Most of his requests for them could basically be boiled down to stop being weird, and they had certainly not done that much. And there was still the very real possibility that they were the cause of all this chaos. But still, since they were on camera anyway. You want to earn my trust? Start by warning us before we run into trouble, he ordered, unwilling to budge on his position that they wouldn't use the path predetermined for them by the mystery person. However, if they wanted to prove themselves, a possible extra bit of information with no strings attached could certainly be helpful. I assume you're surveilling this entire station at this point? For a moment, Avezlon was silent. Very well, they then finally announced, in a tone that would suggest a sigh being attached to it, although Avezlon made no such noise of displeasure. But be careful. Even I have blind spots. Was never planning on doing anything else, James assured them firmly, but less harshly than his previous words. Take care. Be safe. He allowed Avezlon to get out, right before he hung up the call. The next long minutes of advancement were filled with the same tense yet monotonous movements of checking the way ahead before slowly advancing. Despite the slight detour, they were still on a good way to arrive at their destination. According to the publicly available information, the main shuttle ports had luckily been one of the first things the local forces had secured from the riot, meaning that they controlled who was getting in and out of the station again, especially now that Avezlon had removed whatever bug they had put into the system. They only had to worry about how they would get to their shuttle. True to their word, Avezlon every now and then alerted James and his companions of possible wrong turns they could accidentally make, or of roads being blocked from safe traversal. Then, usually after confirming the trouble for themselves, just to be sure, the group would slightly alter their route to adjust for it. In the big struggle for territory that had apparently emerged, the trouble had thankfully been concentrated in hotspots that were easy enough to avoid for the most part. Still, every now and then there was the odd window-smashing group that had split off from the main body in their pursuit of chaos and needed to be circled around to avoid likely conflict. Avezlon's blind spots proved to be not much of an issue there, since the squad of humans wasn't relying on their input all too much in the first place. And finally, after weaving their way through the paths less travelled on Scantiot Station, for what must have been closing in on 2 hours of time, they arrived at their next hurdle. They could already hear the screams and yells long before they arrived. Step by step, they pushed themselves past the dark walls of the surrounding buildings that blocked them from seeing anything that was happening just a few meters ahead of them, only hearing the commotion get louder and louder the closer they got to their unseen destination. Until at last, the people leading the way in their little formation peeked around the final turn in the way, taking in what they saw for a few moments before pulling back and reconvening with everyone else as their slowly pushed forward approach clearly wouldn't work from here on out. James himself hadn't yet gotten a look around the corner, since he still had to stand back where it was safest, but he didn't have to be told what was going on. The noise was painting a clear picture. While the local forces likely really had taken control of the shuttle bay, that didn't mean that the rioting populace was no longer making any trouble for them in the meantime. Of course, he didn't know if this had been going on for a while, or if this was just a recent development. However, it sounded like a large group of very displeased felines was currently stress-testing the barricades that had been put up by the law enforcement to secure their position. Some of the bangs were almost deafening, as heavy things collided with steady surfaces. Now they'd have the plan. The entire squad grouped up in a close circle, with the lower-ranked soldiers keeping guard all around while their higher-ups began to discuss their options, with James, obviously, in the centre of it all. I doubt they'll just let us pass, Amos stated matter-of-factly and crossed his arms, leaving his weapon to hang from his right hand. Too bad we didn't get more publicity with the poor folk done. Athena alternatively took her hands off her rifle and pressed them against her forearms in order to get a few loud cracks out of her knuckles. They're cocky because they think they won't be shot at, she commented, now also slowly rotating her shoulders to release some tension that had built up during their journey. If we show them that we're serious, they might get scared and back off. A couple of warning shots could do the trick. Tuya cocked her head to the side of that. Sure, she replied, serious for the most part, but with a hint of sarcasm in her voice. But are you willing to bet on that? What do you think, Shida? The lieutenant turned her head towards the feline, who stood next to James with a serious yet thoughtful expression, a bent finger at her chin. "Couldn't tell you," she replied with a brief shake of her head, after having given it some thought. "Back in my day, we didn't exactly mess around with the armed ones. Guess that's something you grow into." "I would like to avoid shooting one of them to make a point," Andres said in a firm tone. And although his phrasing was exaggerating the situation a bit, everyone knew that they weren't above defending themselves with the necessary force. Still, these people weren't really their enemies. Sadly, this time, there was no way around. "Waiting it out could be an idea," James mumbled, not really bringing it up as an actual proposition, but more wanting to leave no possibility unsaid while they brainstormed. Or more will show up and it will make it worse. Eventually, the situation would surely be brought under control. However, the time in between then and now was worrying. What if the final hurrah of the riot would be an assault launched at this very position? Likely? Not necessarily, but possible. After all, it could very well be that some of the people that had flooded onto the station would want to get away again. And would they want to still be around when that happened? More importantly, would they want their shuttle to still be around them? However, while they were still thinking about that and throwing ideas around, one of the soldiers guarding their way forward suddenly spoke up. "Hasn't it gotten a bit quiet?" he asked. The question wasn't directed at his superiors. He was merely talking to his colleague beside him. However, it got everyone to listen up. "It's really quiet," she'd soon confirmed. And coming from her, that actually meant something. Apparently she had focused on the conversation too much to notice at first, but now that everyone had quietened down, even her fine hearing seemingly didn't pick up on the ruckus any longer. As they were still momentarily wondering what was happening, James couldn't help but release a deep sigh when he felt the brief nudge of a vibration in his pocket yet again. "I didn't ask for your help," James merely snapped into the microphone as soon as a connection had been established. At this point he was beginning to get rather sick of Avezlon's help. It felt like it was unlike him, given that they had legitimately been helpful so far. However, Sheeta's words of "whatever they want, we don't want to pay it" still echoed in his mind, even after all this time. Back then, it was about a rather innocuous favour, so what could the price for something like this turn out to be? "I don't have to be asked to help people," Avezlon replied, sounding only slightly perturbed by his aggressive attitude. "Besides, I just sped up the process a bit." James was about to give a rather unpleasant reply, as he suddenly felt a hand on his shoulder. Andres looked back at him, and although they were obscured by the breath filter and only visible as vague projections on his visor, James could see the Major's crimson eyes gently stare into his own before his inner eye. "Let it go," his former boss and trainer said softly. "It's done now. No point in harping on it. You can discuss it all later." James looked back at him, and suddenly he felt the tenseness that had taken hold of his entire body. In his strong desire to stay calm throughout this ordeal, he had at some point started to transform all the mental strain he tried to avoid into physical strain. He swallowed the words that were still right on the tip of his tongue, and he let out the breath he had taken to release them in a long exhale through his nose, taking care to breathe out all the tension he was carrying in his shoulders, arms and chest with it. Listening deep inside of himself, he took note of all the stress the situation had brought with it. The uncertainty of Avezlon's help, the concerns about what Quaffren was hiding from him, the fears for everyone's safety. And slowly he began to round them out, trying to find a balance with them. Meanwhile, Andres stood up straighter and began addressing everybody else. "We probably won't get another opportunity like this," he said, standing tall and letting his gaze glide along his subordinates. "Let's move while we still can." Despite everyone likely having second thoughts about the methods that had achieved this, none of the soldiers needed to be told twice. Their slow and steady approach took an effect. They began to form up and got ready to cross the last road, while keeping everything proper and safe. They wouldn't let their guard down now. "We're not done talking about this," James said firmly into the phone, although the aggression had now vanished from his voice. Inside him, his emotions had once again formed what he imagined to be an even ball, encompassing all of them inside in a uniform distribution. And feeling like this was a good time to remember his manners. He added, "But thank you." "You're welcome," Avezlon replied, before cutting the connection from their side. The crossing of the last street proved to be no obstacle to the diplomatic delegation. The rioting people, presumably after receiving a strange message or something of the like, it suddenly packed up and turned heel, leaving the law enforcement that had been hard at work with repelling them to confusedly scratch their heads as they wondered what had just happened. For a moment, they seemed to get a bit of a fright when they saw the masked and heavily armed group of darkly dressed individuals approaching them. However, confusing the human delegation with a bunch of writing Miat was a pretty hard thing to do, and recognition soon set in for the felines. Although it was hard to miss that some of them were quite baffled that the arrival of the humans had been preceded by such a hasty retreat of the rioters. Still, one of them broke formation and bolted over to the barricade to meet them halfway. "Ambassador," they greeted with a sigh of relief, their tails swaying like the world's most elated worm. "It's good to see you safe. We heard about what happened in the bunker." The approaching feline was quickly stopped from getting any closer by the two foremost soldiers of the formation. Noticing this, they repelled slightly and calmly raised their hands. But James still nodded at them calmingly. "I told them we would be fine, and we were," he said, while the group tried to push forward still, wanting to get off the street as soon as possible, and just pushing the feline along with them. "And now we would like to get off this station, at least until the situation is under control." There was a glimmer in the Miat officer's eyes for a second. "Of course," they announced, and went ahead to help their colleagues open the barricade for the arriving entourage. The general tone of "you gave us quite the fright," and "we were worried we'd have to go look for you," was echoed by some of the other Miat officers, at least by those that had a good grasp of GU. The barrier consisted of sturdy mobile fences, clearly made of some polycarbon, that were secured to massive concrete-like foundations as well as to each other with enormous locks. However, once those locks had been opened, it was easy enough for a group of strong Miat to move the individual panels slightly, so that people could pass through. Right behind the fencing were stepladder-like towers that allowed for the defending forces to easily look over the barricade, while also providing some structural support in case a large group would try to topple it by force. Currently, there was one Miat on each of those, except for the one empty ladder that had been left behind when their first creature had jumped over the barricade. One by one, the humans and Shida were led through a small gap created between the panels, squeezing themselves past these small towers, and into the more or less secured area leading towards the shuttle bay. Already, James could feel the general tension relax a bit. They had made it. Admittedly with some help, but they had made it. It wasn't exactly the scariest thing James had ever been through, but he was still glad that it was over. As they suddenly poured into the cordoned-off area in a neat line, some more of the Miat officers came to greet them, and soon they were guided along towards their shuttle by a big group, all of whom loudly talked and congratulated them for making it here unscathed. This was just about the most attention they had gotten since arriving on Dunama, but maybe, after all this, they had earned it. Altogether, they passed through the first glass door to the main shuttle bay area, behind which the individual bays were separated by thick, airtight doors, so the rooms could be voided for incoming or leaving shuttles. Already, the door leading to their shuttle was in sight. Suddenly, James felt something tug on him. Sheeta's hand had tightly closed around his, only moments before he was suddenly pulled back, yanking on his arm heavily. Thinking that she was trying to get his attention, he turned his head to see what was up. However, to his confusion, he found that she was actually pulling his arm because one of the Miat soldiers had suddenly tried to push themselves in between the two of them, and she had apparently just about managed to grab his hand before she had been forced back. Looking at the feline officer confusedly, James wanted to ask something like, "Hey pal, what's the big idea?" However, before he could get anything out, he suddenly felt another hand pull on him. Hard. However, instead of gently holding onto his hand, this one was tightly wrapped around his wrist, and clearly tried to pull him in the opposite direction of the way Sheeta was being forced. At the very same second, he suddenly heard trouble break up behind and in front of him, as multiple voices erupted in different versions of "Haze" or "What's?" And then, at an instant, everything broke out into chaos. With a surprising force that shot as jolts of pain through his arm, James felt himself be yanked back yet again, feeling a Miat's explosive strength firsthand as he was pulled aside without being able to do much about it. He wasn't a weak man by any stretch of the imagination. However, the feline's muscles were simply built to release more force at once, and there was little he could do about that, as he felt his other hand being torn free from Sheeta's grasp. Simultaneously, a cacophony of familiar voices loudly yelped out all around him, as their owners were also suddenly grabbed by the surrounding felines. Now that they had seemingly arrived at their destination, they had broken formation for just a few seconds. A rookie mistake, one that now proved to be costly. Despite the difference in strength, James was still much larger and heavier than the Miette pulling on him, and he managed to throw his weight around to a point where he forced the feline to allow him to turn around so he could see what was happening. However, at the same time, another Miette suddenly grabbed him from behind, trying to get their arms around his much larger frame. His teammates and guards, all seemingly taken by surprise, were fending off the Miette's attempts to seemingly detain them, with varying degrees of success. Tuya being the shortest of them all, and also not enjoying an upbringing with a high dose of testosterone in her blood, struggled the most, as the long fingers of the feline holding her grasped at her forehead to try and gain control over her head, forcing it back while another one tried to control her weapon arm. Hard kicks from her legs seemed to bother them little, as they shrugged up most of the hits, especially since it was hard for her to gain the right footing or angle for a serious attack. Admir and Andrej, and most of the other soldiers they had with them, were on a somewhat more even playing field, but they also had to contend with the Miette's greater strength, as well as the fact that they were outnumbered. They struggled and thrashed, trying to not allow the felines to get a good grasp on them, while also firmly hanging onto their weapons that another was trying to take away from them. Meanwhile, Athena had gone fully on the offensive. The lean woman was much more flexible with her angles of attack than any of her colleagues were, and she managed to surprise her assailant with well-placed, powerful kicks that forced the Miette to momentarily give up on their attempt at keeping her under control. Shida had been fully pulled out of his view. Meanwhile, James also felt a warm, padded hand grasp for his head, fingers painfully digging into his skin while trying to forcibly move it. Meanwhile, a second feline hung onto his weapon arm for dear life, determined not to let him reach for his gun. However, as anger bubbled up inside him, he didn't even have time to wonder if these people had bad intel on him, or if they had merely miscalculated, and he didn't care either. All he knew for sure is that they had made a bad move. Restraining him wasn't quite so easy anymore, and now he was seeing red. Completely unrestrained by any biological limitations, James's right arm effortlessly tore free from the hand trying to hold it and shot around. Uncoiling like a striking snake, it lurched backwards, hitting the feline trying to restrain his head hard enough in the stomach that it pressed all the air out of them. This weakened their grasp enough so that James could finally thrash his body to the side, tearing free from their hold while leaving red marks on his skin, and bringing his mechanical arm around with him in a narrow arc, using all the momentum and force behind it to hit the other Miette square in the chest, feeling cartilage, or maybe bone, he wasn't sure, crack under the impact. His assailant immediately released his organic hand, sagging forward with a breathless gag, desperately trying to suck in air with their tongue hanging out of their mouth, while their lungs stubbornly refused. James didn't have time or patience to pity the writhing creature as they fell to their knees. His free hand now quickly shot down to reach for his gun, and put a damn end to this madness. At the same time, his eyes scanned around looking for Shida. She must have been just outside of his view earlier. Where was... Before he could finish his thought, a piercing primal scream echoed throughout the large room.